Business transformation is, in effect, a crisis.
The goal of transformation isn't necessarily to reduce the number of people, but that's often what happens.
Sometimes losing money is an investment because you've gained that experience.
It's not just marketing that eats strategy for breakfast, but also a solid strategy.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the second part of our discussion on business transformation. You can watch the first part by following the link in the description below this video. Business transformation is in effect a crisis. I think that during transformation, a company experiences stress and to some extent finds itself in a crisis situation. Naturally, if owners have stepped away from day-to-day management and serve, for example, on the board when they see a crisis, they're very likely to want to return to operational management. The same applies to board members. Many of them have executive experience and accordingly may be inclined toward micromanagement from the board, which is a major setback in the short term. How does that work? How can this be avoided so that it doesn't happen?
Personally, I wouldn't try to prevent it. I'd rather assume it should be put to good use, because it's actually best when owners feel the pain of losing money or missing opportunities. So, when they benchmark themselves against another company, they estimate the numbers and think, oh, we could do something differently here, but we won't. And it's great when they understand that sometimes a crisis like in 2008 or 2014 is also a very powerful signal that while we may not be able to grow the business, we can fix all the mistakes we've accumulated and turn them into a much stronger infrastructure. And when owners do come back, that can be used as an opportunity to resolve many issues and prepare that infrastructure for the next stage of growth. Because sometimes when we talk about stabilizing a company, if it's a genuine crisis, we simply can't start the transformation because there aren't enough resources. First, we have to survive. Then we can gradually or quickly plan the transformation. And when the owners step back in, they can indeed stop certain processes, products, or projects that can free up those resources. In other words, during a crisis, top management isn't always inclined to reallocate resources in the most effective way. That's why you need the owner to say, no, we're stopping here, we need to survive. Let's redirect the resources here. So I'd see the owner's involvement as a positive factor.
So, it's not a problem, but rather
an opportunity, but with some problems.
To a certain extent, you have to approach this very carefully. I completely agree that issues get resolved very quickly. But sometimes speed can become excessive. And if the owner returns to operational management, it's important that this doesn't turn into the well-known seagull management. In that case, the board's role and involvement can provide the necessary balance to those decisions. Because yes, these are genuinely fast decisions, fast processes, rapid changes, all accompanied by a certain level of accountability. Because while discussing transformation, we've almost set the whole issue of accountability aside. Yet it's a fundamental thing, and it's something management sometimes lacks. For an owner, making decisions and taking responsibility is second nature, including the responsibility to rebuild the company, whether to save it or move it forward. But having a counterbalance in the form of expertise and advice is essential, including to make sure the company isn't torn apart, but instead continues moving according to a structured plan, even with different options and different scenarios. Perhaps one approach didn't work, but we had another scenario, we made the decision and we moved in that direction. That's very good. And this is exactly where the board's role as a point of reference becomes especially important. In other words, when an owner says, I want us to be like them, that ambition should be matched with the board's expertise to explain that what works there can't always be replicated here. Yes, some of it can be implemented, but an owner, especially one without that experience, may not always realize it. You called it money lost. I always call it money invested, because they invested in their own process and their own success. Yes, sometimes losing money is an investment because you've gained that experience. And one of the board's responsibilities is to explain to the owner what actually happened there, so as to prevent.
I started smiling because Alexander just reminded me that this is actually a very common request from owners and management. They say, why would you spend money documenting processes? Aren't there already some universal ideal processes out there? We'll just take them and start working. The same goes for a business model. Why should we bother coming up with these kinds of things? Just copy-paste. Why spend resources?
it's already thought out.
It's all been figured out already, and sometimes you spend a few seconds wondering whether this person really runs a business. As people joke about ChatGPT, you can perform an operation and attach someone's left hand to their right, or come up with something else. But that request exists because everyone wants to cut corners and get to their ideal outcome faster. But unfortunately, that's not how it works.
Yes, and in many cases, it's also an attempt to reduce risk, because using practices that have already been implemented gives you the opportunity to see how they were executed, how they work, ask questions, and then apply them in your own company. But unfortunately, that's not always possible. Transformation, in fact, affects every department and every function within the company. And of course, the person leading that transformation, as well as the board, the owners, and the chief transformation officer, all need to understand the company as a whole, as an integrated system. How much does this add additional requirements both to the position of chief transformation officer and to the members of the board who are involved in this transformation?
Well, that's exactly the key requirement from everything we've discussed. You have to look at the whole picture because, unfortunately, isolated solutions can sometimes deliver positive short-term results, only to create the opposite effect later on. Improvements or changes in one area may ultimately lead to losses in another. For example, a company decides to transform and directs all of its transformation efforts into sales. And then sales take off, but the back office can't keep up. That leads to negative reactions from both the market and customers. And since the end customer ultimately pays for every change, it all ends up affecting the company's results. That's why changes have to happen simultaneously. Or sometimes the back office functions even need to provide a boost to support potential growth in sales, service, and customer-facing operations. That's what a holistic approach is all about. And that's exactly where, once again, the board's challenge comes in, to ensure that the transformation program is structured in a way that prevents those kinds of imbalances.
So it has to be as aligned as possible across the entire organization, across the whole system.
Exactly.
If we start from the premise that transformation affects a company's core business processes, then one way or another, if it's a distribution company, for example, transformation will affect both sales and service. Those are the core business processes that generate the company's primary revenue. There are many services. It's impossible to transform sales if procurement and logistics, for example, haven't been transformed as well. That's what your point illustrates. We can hire more salespeople, implement a CRM, and increase our market outreach. But if we don't have enough inventory to support those additional sales, because the company may assume that yesterday we sold 100 units and have 200 in stock, for example, let's say it's units of anything. It doesn't matter what. If we transform sales and they now have the potential to sell 300 units instead of 100, whether kilograms, tons, kilometers, or anything else, but the warehouse still only has 200 units in stock, then we simply can't make it work. It's a simple example showing that a company can't transform only its core business processes. All the surrounding processes have to evolve along with them. That's exactly why it's called transformation. A fundamental change in the company's core business processes that naturally pulls everything else along with it.
We've talked about some of the challenges and issues related to top management accepting these changes. On the other hand, there are probably other challenges and potential issues in the transformation process that also need to be anticipated. What might those be?
A resistance. There will be resistance at every level. So the question is how to find that group. People often say 10 or 25% who can see a brighter and better future after the transformation. Once you found them, that's exactly where you can leverage their influence, because overall the vast majority will almost certainly resist. And you shouldn't expect that. Even if everyone attends a town hall meeting and agrees that we're planning to make changes, most people will still resist afterward. They say that change is always about change management, project management, process management, change management. Those are the three pillars. Alexander can probably give a better estimate based on his own experience, but these are the three key elements that have to be used every single day in different combinations and depending on the stage. You need to prepare for it in advance and develop a plan, then create several scenarios for how people are likely to respond. That's always very interesting.
Well, let's put it this way. I'm not sure about the 10%, maybe even so, yes. The important thing is that this percentage keeps growing. And that's exactly why quick wins and people's involvement are so important. Because the purpose of transformation and of communicating it across the company is not to change people. The goal is not simply to terminate employees or reduce the workforce. Instead, it is to acquire the necessary strategic potential to provide the company with the robust ability to scale effectively, creating the opportunity to grow significantly while utilizing the same, let's say, fundamental operational resources and assets that are already in place. In other words, it's about maximizing that potential. And as for resistance, you don't even have to look very far to find it. After all, no one has repealed the old Chinese saying, "May you never live in times of change."
Well, yes, on the one hand, but on the other, there's the standard mindset. Don't fix what isn't broken. Let's wait until the system in the company, the business itself, breaks down completely. Then we'll come back and start doing something about it.
I'd also like to add that it's important for those 10-15% of people who can see the future after the transformation or who can already envision its expected outcomes to be part of the management team. They should be the heads of functions, departments, and business units. In that sense, I've been quite fortunate because in the company where I currently work, the heads of the business units believed in it, trusted the process, or were able to see that future. And I can rely on people who also understand why these changes are needed. And from them, it becomes much easier to reach middle and lower management rather than going over their heads, because it also happens that middle managers step aside and say, like, my team is against it, come and prove to them that this is necessary. So basically, I'm here and what can I do? So like, let's just work with my subordinates on the transformation. That means the person doesn't really trust it, doesn't want to risk their reputation, steps aside, and effectively gives permission for, say, a transformation officer to work with their subordinates. In my view, that is not correct. As long as the person leading the team is not involved and does not believe the transformation is needed, the results of engaging their team will most likely be negative. The goal of transformation is not always and not entirely about reducing the number of people, although that does happen, and people are already smart enough when they see this process. And it's not because the goal is cost reduction or making things cheaper, it's just that we always discover so much when we transform something that we then realize that unfortunately for new processes we either need to train people very quickly and additionally to support them, or we simply cannot find the match, and we need to either bring specialists or managers from the market or automate processes so that there is simply no, unfortunately, human factor because, for example, a new level of service cannot be achieved with the part of the team we originally planned. The point is that people understand that, yes, this is not the goal, but unfortunately, when they look at what happened in other companies, they are like, okay, this is when studying lean. They communicate this. They always say that we first reduce a certain percentage, 10, 20, sometimes even 30% of people, but then we promise that we will not touch anyone anymore. Those who perform effectively will be continuously utilized because this is continuous improvement, Kaizen, and all that. But still, it happens that some people don't make it or simply say that for this money and this level of transformation, it is not for me. And they look for career opportunities outside the company. But you have to be prepared that some people will simply leave, either as initiators of this or because they decide so themselves, since the workload will be significantly higher throughout the entire transformation process.
And probably corporate culture has a very strong influence here. If it supports business transformation, then of course there will be fewer cases of losing valuable employees. And probably transformation itself also impacts corporate culture.
Absolutely. I'm very glad that, as you can see, in the end of our conversation, we arrived at cultural factors, at people, and at anthropology. So in reality, how do we work with people? How do we turn them into supporters, into promoters? In the end, if I don't want to say the fluff of business, it's not fluff, these are important methodological things, but everything ultimately comes down to people, to the direct work of managers with their subordinates, who ideally should support this transformation, because without that, even if it is written in books, or competitors are already doing it, or we need to survive, there can be many reasons. But all of this comes down to culture, to people, and culture can be said to eat not only advertising and marketing for breakfast, but
strategy as well.
Culture is not only strategy, but also
business transformation.
A business transformation. We've already said that business transformation is part of the strategic process, so it's like a dessert that can also be consumed. Yes, 100%.
What could be recommended to an owner, a board, a top team, a company that is at the beginning of a business transformation at the start of such a large project?
I would advise starting with calculations to test either fear or greed, so that owners first see that if we continue as we are, we will have roughly these kinds of results. Probably some negative trend, something will deteriorate, but if there is an additional factor, then everything could become really bad. But we also have the opportunity to rebuild the company earlier than competitors, to use certain opportunities, and then a brighter future awaits us, so that they see that we will either gain several additional millions or tens of millions, while we need to spend, for example, 1 million in 12 months of our life, so that they have the opportunity to compare these things and start thinking what is holding us back now, whether we can wait, and what the risk is. And I would bet either on greed, on wanting to gain more and starting immediately, or on fear that if we don't do everything now, we will simply exit the market.
And this continues what we said earlier regarding risk management. This is also about engagement and initiative from the board to properly evaluate the calculations that will form the basis for all of this. Because in order not to implement anything, a business can always draw whatever numbers it wants. Excel can withstand anything. You can create any calculations that provide a foundation for the conclusion that everything is fine, the war will end, Trump will stop introducing tariffs, China will finally back off Taiwan, Greenland will somehow become the fourth largest economy in the world and similar scenarios, and will be able to sell there. Therefore, the board of directors must verify these calculations. On the other hand, it should also look at what we discussed, the plan that will lead these transformational changes into a new model. There may be certain scenarios or different consequences in order to achieve this.
I would always recommend keeping in mind throughout the transformation process the original premises that led us here. Why exactly a year or two ago, or even yesterday, we decided that this transformation was necessary, and the goals we set at that time and why we are doing it. Because during the process, something may be forgotten or transformed again, and in the awareness of all participants in the process, we may gradually lose sight of why we started this in the first place. So it's important to return to this from time to time and keep in mind where we are heading. In other words, why we are doing it and what we expect in the end. And this, by the way, is largely a board function. If business transformation is part of strategic planning and strategy execution, then the board, as a kind of watchdog over that strategy, should not forget and should remind stakeholders why we started this, what triggered this costly and time-consuming process, and where we are heading. I would also maybe add regular communication. It's not always only the board that can do this, but also management. I've seen opportunities for regular quarterly meetings, gatherings of all the people, and during the all hands, it's essential to include a 15 to 30-minute update on what has happened, like our quick wins, maybe the next priorities for the upcoming quarter. For transformation, OKRs work very well, for example, to maintain focus across teams. And with this kind of regular communication, we get more support, and our goal is that this is hopefully not the last transformation in the company's life. We need to make it part of the company's DNA, having a certain number of people who perceive continuous improvement or transformation as something positive, as an opportunity for career growth, and then they will expect it and generate ideas themselves. So if this is the company's first major transformation, it should be done in a way that doesn't leave everyone burned out and resigned, but instead leaves a portion of people who remember it as something exciting, energizing, and something they can build the next cycle on. Because in companies that operate for decades, you need to maintain both the experience and the motivation of people to stay and look forward to the next stages. Absolutely, because the environment is changing so fast that one transformation or many small transformations essentially combine into one big transformation. And it's not always clear where one ends and another begins. Well, that's the world we live in.
Who is a responsible leader for a transformation? That should be the board, the CEO, or the Chief Transformation Officer. Where can we find people who are qualified to do this?
This is also a question for each individual company. If the company has a clear, progressive, and forward-looking CEO, it is probably ideal for the transformation to be led under their direction. And sometimes, such a person can even be found within the existing team. Again, it depends on the size of the company and its current stage of development. Sometimes you can grow your own Baba Yaga internally. In some cases, the situation is such that in most cases, external teams are brought in either to implement information system changes or to handle more in-depth processes that require broader involvement. Because even a change in an accounting system affects all other functions. For companies that have gone through this, it is to a certain extent a recurring process. We replaced System X with something else, and there was a team that came in and handled it. Returning to that percentage again, why it should exist and ideally grow over time, because even an external team, despite having expertise and a broad view of how transformation should happen, must rely on and receive feedback from internal management. It is very important to keep that internal team engaged. I have been through several transformations myself. One of the key requirements, including from the board, is that the maximum number of employees involved in projects should remain with the team until the end of the project, because they are the ones who form the new DNA of the company. And through their work, this then spreads throughout the organization. That is why this percentage grows. And even internal MPS surveys are later conducted to understand how many % are engaged and how the company perceives it. Can the board lead the transformation process? Well, in my opinion, the role of the board is slightly different. It should accompany this process at the level of alignment with strategic goals, and among other things, keep the owners focused on this process. But to lead it, well, let's put it this way. This is not operational management, and to a certain extent, it goes beyond the traditional scope of the board. Their role is very important, without any doubt, but it is somewhat different.
I would add that the board can be, and often is, the owner and sponsor of the process, but the executive role still belongs to the CEO or, and here I agree with Alexander as well, it may be possible to find such a person internally. Usually the simplest option is someone like an operations director or something similar, an operations manager. Sometimes they say change manager. That's also possible. However, if it is an external team or manager, it is important to understand how the relationship will be structured because the transformation eventually comes to an end. Unfortunately, even though this person may have been very popular in the company before, after this process, there is not always an opportunity to continue their career. So here, the relationship has to include both responsibility and, on the other hand, a way to transfer this experience without becoming a parasite within the company. It is also about fulfilling your role, doing what was necessary, and agreed. And the internal path seems simpler, but it may lack sufficient competence or experience. The external path, on the other hand, requires board experience. It is also about how to build the framework of cooperation with such a person or team, because it is not always an easy thing to do. The board, how they select people and structure the compensation system for such chief transformation officers, is also important because people do not build a long-term career as a chief transformation officer in one company. They need to deliver results. They are also motivated to make those results visible to the market afterwards. They are motivated not to fail because otherwise other companies will not hire them, but it is very difficult to do this in an environment with incomplete support from owners and limited alignment from management. That is why the board can be a very strong, experienced sponsor who defines this entire interaction framework and significantly increases the probability of success. The board can be an ideologue, a sponsor, and in a sense a carrier of the ideology of why this is being done, why we are doing it. These are more philosophical but still very conceptual questions. The board should be the source of answers to them, and regarding who should lead the process. And ideally, it is the CEO or a chief transformation officer reporting to them. I would like to briefly outline the characteristics of this person. In my view, first of all, this is definitely a person who is not indifferent and who is highly energized. In other words, a person who has an internal drive for change. Not change for the sake of change, but a person who moves forward, who is not indifferent to what will happen to the company in this market. Secondly, this person must also have some strategic vision, meaning they should be both a strategist and a visionary. In other words, they should think 2 or 3 steps ahead, into the future. And third, I would emphasize that this person should, in a sense, be a researcher and an experimenter, a person who is not stopped by failures or by situations that do not work out because of resistance, which we have discussed extensively. In other words, this person should look for alternative paths. If the door is closed, they go through the window. If the window is closed, they go through the door and ultimately still achieve results. And what will this person be called? That depends on the company. In English, resilience, right? Yes.
Alexander, Armen, Oleg, thank you very much for your insights, your recommendations, and the exchange of experience. This topic is truly very important, very interesting, and very relevant for today's business. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. See you on the Board of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel.